November 24th, 1944, 27,000 HON-FT above Tokyo, Japanese fighter pilots climbed through freezing cold air, engines screaming at full power, trying to reach the silver bombers, leaving long contrails across their sky. The K-84 Hayat, Japan's best interceptor, could barely reach 30,000 feet. When it got there, the pilot had no energy left to fight, no speed to chase, just enough power to watch. Inside those American bombers, men worked in shirt sleeves, no oxygen masks, no electrically heated suits, no frostbite turning fingers black. They drank coffee while Japanese fighters struggled and died 5,000 OFT below, clawing at air too thin to support real combat. Every other nation built bombers the same way. More guns, bigger bombs, faster engines. One Boeing engineer looked at a luxury airliner and asked a question nobody else thought to ask. The technology existed, the mathematics worked, but using a pressurized cabin in combat, the Army said it was impossible. His own colleagues called it a 3,000 lb gamble that would get crews killed. He built it anyway, and when Japanese commanders realized what they were facing, they understood a terrible truth. America had built a bomber they could see but never touch. February 1940, Boeing headquarters, Seattle. Wellwood Beale walked into a conference room where Army Air Corps procurement officers sat waiting for proposals that looked like every other. Bomber design, more horsepower, heavier guns, bigger bomb loads. The vice president of engineering at Boeing carried blueprints that asked for something nobody requested, and most people would consider insane. Heavy bombers in 1940 operated at 20,000 to 25,000 odd FT maximum. Crews wore oxygen masks connected to bottles that froze their regulators, electrically heated suits that worked only when the wiring didn't short out. Men still got frostbite and still passed out from lack of oxygen on missions lasting 12 hours. The accepted wisdom said speed and firepower were the only way to succeed. Defenses that mattered. You couldn't outrun fighters, so you outgunned them. You couldn't avoid flak, so you armored against it. Altitude was limited by human endurance, and human endurance stopped where the air got too thin to breathe. Beale had watched Boeing's 307 Stratliner cruise at 20,000 RFT in 1939, while passengers in the pressurized cabin sipped coffee without oxygen masks. The technology worked. It added weight, about 3,000 lb for the reinforced fuselage and pressurization equipment. But Beale had asked his chief engineer a question that changed everything. What if we took that technology to war? Ed Wells ran the ED calculations with the careful precision that made him one of the most respected aircraft designers in America. A pressurized cabin would add $3,000 lb to the airframe, but operating at 30,000 feet or higher would put bombers beyond the reach of most enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The thin air at that altitude meant much less drag. A bomber could fly faster on the same fuel, and crews working in shirt-sleeve comfort at cabin pressure equal to 8,000 psi would stay sharper, make better decisions, and complete longer missions than frozen men sucking bottled oxygen through masks that fogged and froze. The Army officers listened. Some looked doubtful. Pressurization belonged on luxury airliners flying executives across the country, not combat aircraft getting shot at over enemy territory. One puncture in that pressurized fuselage, and the whole idea failed. The weight cost meant fewer bombs or less fuel. The complexity meant more maintenance, more failures, more ways for the system to hurt its own crew. Beale let Wells explain the math. At 31,850 FT traveling 350 mi, a bomber would operate in airspace where enemy fighters simply could not follow. Japan's best interceptors topped out around 25,000 IFT in combat. Even if they could reach 30,000 IFT, they would arrive with no energy left to maneuver, no speed to pursue. The bomber wouldn't need to fight enemy interceptors. It would fly where they couldn't reach. The enemy could see the contrails. They could watch the bombers pass overhead. They just couldn't do anything about it. The harsh math of aerial war suddenly flipped. Instead of building a flying fortress that survived by taking hits, Boeing proposed building one that won by never getting hit at all. Altitude is armor, thin air as a defensive weapon. The pressurized cabin wasn't a luxury feature. It was the key that unlocked an entirely new altitude band, where American bombers would operate alone. The Army placed an order. Development began by September 21, 1942, Eddie Allen, the test pilot, whose judgment was so trusted that insurance companies offered lower premiums. If he flew first flights, lifted the silver B29 off Boeing Field runway, wingspan 141, FT4 massive R3352 engines each, producing 2,200 horsepower revolutionary remote-controlled gun turrets that let a single gunner control multiple positions, and that pressurized fuselage he had bet. Boeing's future on the first flight showed the bomber's breathtaking potential. It also showed the fatal flaw that would kill 32 people within 5 months. The R3350 duplex Cyclone engines had high magnesium content in the crankcase. When those engines caught fire, and they caught fire often, the magnesium burned at 5,600 degrees F, hot enough to melt through aluminum wing spars in seconds, hot enough that no fire suppression system could stop it. The rear cylinders overheated because cowling clearances were too small. Valves failed because fuel distribution was uneven. Oil, leaked fuel, leaked, and when ignition happened, the magnesium parts turned into incendiary devices that ate the airplane from the inside. December 30, 1942, Eddie Allen brought the second B29 back from a test flight with engine number 4 trailing. Ribbons of fire at 5,000 rafters. He landed with the cockpit filling with smoke. The wing spar already damaged minutes from structural failure. The fire crews put out the blaze. Allen climbed out. The Army gave him the Air Medal for saving the aircraft. 3 weeks later, he climbed back into that same bomber for one more test flight. By then, President Roosevelt had already made his promise to Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. At the Cairo conference, B-29s would bomb Japan from Chinese bases by April 1944. When Roosevelt made that promise, fewer than 100 B-29s existed, and only 15% of them were actually flyable. The Army had ordered hundreds more. Workers in Wichita were assembling bombers outdoors, in temperatures 20 degrees below zero, rotating. In 20-minute shifts to avoid frostbite, $3 billion more than the $9 billion spent on the Manhattan Project. The most expensive weapons program in American history now rested on engines that killed the airplanes they powered. Wellwood Bale's big idea had created a bomber that could fly higher than any enemy fighter could reach. But first, it had to survive its own engines long enough to prove the idea worked. February 18, 1943, 12:17 p.m., Boeing Field, XB-29, serial number 41003, climbed through 5,000 FT with Eddie Allen at the controls. The test flight was routine, checking fixes made after the December fire. Allen had flown burning aircraft before. He had landed bombers that should have killed everyone aboard. His calm under pressure was legendary. Insurance companies trusted his judgment more than their own actuarial tables. The number 1 engine caught fire at 5,200 feet. Allen shut it down immediately, activated the carbon dioxide fire suppression system, and turned the bomber back toward Boeing Field. Standard emergency procedure. He had done this before. The fire should have gone out. It didn't. A second fire erupted. Radio operator Harry Riston's voice cut through the cockpit intercom, stripped of the professional calm that air crews kept even in crisis. "Alan better get this thing down in a hurry. The wing spar is burning badly." The B29 was no longer just an airplane with an engine fire. It was a structure being consumed from inside by magnesium burning at temperatures that could melt steel. The fire ate through hose clamps, valve, housings, mounting brackets, and components that held the engine to the wing. Parts began falling away. The bomber shed debris over Seattle neighborhoods as Alan fought to keep it in the air long enough to reach the runway. 3 crewmen jumped at 250 feet too low. Parachutes needed at least 500 feet to open properly. The silk canopies were still opening when the men hit the ground. None survived. Alan kept flying. The runway was visible. Boeing Field was right there. The B29 clawed through air thick enough to fly in. The magnesium fire now burned through. The main wing spar, the single structural member that held the wing attached to the fuselage. At this point, there was no saving the aircraft, only the question of where it would crash. It came down short of the runway. The fry packing plant, a meat processing facility, sat directly in the impact zone. The bomber crashed through the building's roof at 12:28 p.m. Monsieur Eddie Allen died instantly. 8 other crewmen died in the impact. 19 workers in the packing plant, processing meat for wartime rations, were killed when 5,600 fire swept through the building. A firefighter died fighting the magnesium blaze that consumed what remained. Total dead, 32. The backlash was immediate. $3 billion, 32 dead. The most expensive weapons program in American history had just burned itself to ashes over Seattle. Critics in Congress called for cancellation. Army Air Force officers questioned whether the whole concept was flawed. The engines were clearly the problem. Everyone could see it. Wright Aeronautical's R3350 engines were killing the airplanes they powered, but there was no other engine capable of producing 2,200 horsepower at 30,000 ton. There was no time to build a replacement, and no way to meet Roosevelt's deadline with a redesign. The Army gave Boeing an almost impossible ultimatum. Fix the engines, keep the pressurized cabin that added $3,000 daily B, and drove the entire design philosophy, and meet the April 1944 deadline for combat operations, or see the whole program transfer to Consolidated's B-32, a conventional unpressurized bomber that gave up the altitude advantage Bale had bet everything on. Spring and summer of 1943 became a race between engineering and politics. Boeing engineers, Wright aeronautical technicians, and Army Air Force specialists focused on the R3350 problem with wartime urgency that made peacetime schedules irrelevant. The engine went through tens of thousands of design changes, not hundreds, tens of thousands. Every part that failed got redesigned. Every system that caused overheating was re-engineered. The cowling, the metal shroud around the engine, was completely redesigned to increase airflow over the rear cylinders. The original design choked cooling air at low speeds, exactly when overloaded bombers needed it most during takeoff. The new cowling opened passages that doubled airflow when the aircraft climbed at full power. The carburetor system was removed entirely. Early R3350 engines mixed fuel and air in carburetors, then forced the mixture through a poorly designed elbow into the supercharger. The sharp bend created turbulence that made fuel go unevenly across 18 cylinders. Some cylinders ran lean and overheated. Others ran rich and fouled spark plugs. Direct fuel injection removed the carburetor and the elbow, spraying exactly measured fuel directly into each cylinder. Hot spots disappeared. Power became reliable. Propeller cuffs, metal fairings around. The base of each propeller blade were added to direct cooling air straight onto the exhaust valves. The valves were failing because they worked at temperatures beyond what their metal could handle. More airflow meant lower temperatures. Lower temperatures meant valves that didn't fall apart after 50 hours of use. Later production runs replaced the magnesium crankcases with steel. Heavier, but steel didn't burn at 5600 grader. The early B-29s, already being built, kept their magnesium engines. Those planes would fly combat missions knowing that any engine fire could destroy them in seconds. Even with all the fixes, the R-3350 stayed temperamental. Time between overhauls went from 100 hours to 400 hours by the end of the war, barely enough for an engine that had to power 15-hour combat missions. The engines would still kill B-29 crews during the war, but fewer, and enough crews survived to prove whether Beil's pressurized cabin idea worked. By May 1944, 130 B-29s completed the 11,500-mile trip to bases in China and India. Workers had built them faster than all the fixes could be installed. Some planes had engines with all modifications. Some had engines with only half. All carried. Crews who knew they were flying experimental bombers into combat before testing was finished. June 15, 1944, the first B-29 mission against Japan since Doolittle's raid in 1942 took off. 68 bombers headed for the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. 47 reached the target. 6 planes were lost. The mission failed to destroy the steel works. Bomb accuracy from high altitude was worse than predicted. The weather was worse than expected. Everything was harder than the planners suggested. Critics sharpened their arguments. $3 billion, poor results, crews still dying. But the missions went on because hidden in the after-action reports was a fact that changed everything. Summer and fall of 1944 showed a pattern that proved Wellwood Beale's vision and revealed the R-3350 engine's continued danger. B-29s kept dying on the ground, overloaded with fuel and bombs on tropical airfields where temperatures went above 100 degrees. The Wright engines overheated within minutes of full throttle. The planes needed every foot of runway to get into the air at maximum weight, 140,000 kcal. When an engine caught fire during that climb, pilots had seconds to choose: abort and probably survive, losing the mission, or continue and possibly die, finishing the takeoff. The early B-29 tactics combined maximum weights with hot airfields, creating conditions that even the fixed cowlings and fuel injection systems couldn't handle. The engines destroyed their own valves, with exhaust valves failing from heat, falling into cylinders, and ruining pistons. When magnesium parts caught fire during takeoff, the fires reached white-hot temperatures, 5,600 degrees F, hot enough to burn through main wing spars in seconds, giving crews no time to escape before the plane broke apart. Mechanics developed rituals. Some whispered prayers over engine cowlings before closing them. Others did checks in certain orders that had no technical reason but felt necessary. Crews watched other bombers burn on takeoff and knew their turn might come. The engines killed randomly. No pattern predicted which aircraft would make it and which would become funeral pyres at the runway's end. Some mechanics just ran when engines started, too afraid to watch another crew die. But the bombers that survived takeoff and reached operational altitude became something the Japanese had never faced: untouchable. At 31,150 ft, flying 350 meters, the B-29 operated in airspace that Japanese fighters could barely reach and could not fight in. The math Beale and Wells had calculated in 1940 was proving correct in combat. Japan did not have a fighter capable of attacking B-29s above 30,000 ft effectively. The few that could climb that high arrived with no energy left for combat maneuvers. November 24, 1944, 111 B-29s attacked Tokyo in the first major raid on the Japanese capital since Doolittle. They flew at altitudes from 27,000 to 31,000 ft. The formations recorded 184 fighter attacks. Japanese pilots threw everything they had into defense. Ki-84 Hayats, Ki-44 Shokis, even older Zero fighters pushed beyond their limits. One damaged fighter rammed a B-29 over the target, destroying it in the only combat loss of the raid. B-29 gunners shot down 5 Japanese fighters. The other 178 attacks failed to score kills. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was just as ineffective. Guns designed to engage bombers at $20,000 FT couldn't reach 30,000 with enough velocity to damage. Hardened targets. Shells that did reach altitude had flight times so long that bomber formations simply maneuvered around predicted impact points. The pressurized cabins meant crews could watch searchlights and flak bursts through clear canopies, tracking threats while maintaining formation discipline impossible in unpressurized aircraft, where oxygen deprivation degraded judgment. The defensive armament worked exactly as Boeing designed it, remote-controlled turrets with computerized fire. Control meant a single gunner could engage multiple targets simultaneously. The central fire control operator could direct all guns toward threats that individual gunners couldn't see. But the real defense was altitude, Japanese fighters that managed. To climb high enough to attempt attacks found themselves in air too thin for their engines to produce combat power. They couldn't accelerate, couldn't climb, couldn't turn aggressively without stalling. The few that positioned themselves correctly. In front of bomber formations, the only effective attack angle could make one pass before running out of airspeed and falling away. As few Japanese fighter models flew fast enough above 20,000 ft to overtake the bombers in a chase positioning. Fighters at the correct altitude in front of formations became the critical tactical problem, but even perfect positioning didn't guarantee success. The Ki-84 Hayate, Japan's finest interceptor, could barely touch 30,000 ft in combat configuration. When it got there, the pilot was managing an aircraft at the edge of its performance envelope with no margin for error. One aggressive maneuver could stall the fighter and send it spinning down through 15,000 ft before the pilot recovered control. If he recovered at all. Mission after mission confirmed the pattern. B-29s operating at designed altitude owned the sky crews flew more than 32,000 sorties over Japan and scored 914 aerial victories against Japanese fighters. The defensive systems worked. The tactics worked. The operational concept BL had proposed in 1940, build a bomber that flies where the enemy cannot reach, was proving correct in the most demanding laboratory imaginable combat against a determined enemy, fighting for survival. By late 1944, Japanese pilots knew what they faced. American bombers flying in formations at altitudes their fighters couldn't effectively operate in. Protected by defensive firepower, they couldn't safely approach delivering bombs they couldn't prevent. The pressurized cabins meant B-29 crews stayed sharp through 12 to 15-hour missions. No frostbite turning fingers black and useless. No oxygen deprivation causing mistakes that killed entire crews. No electrically heated. Suits shorting out and leaving men hypothermic. Just comfortable crews in short-sleeve environment, making precise decisions and doing complex tasks, while Japanese fighters struggled 5,000 ft below. Visible through the bombardier's clear nose. Unable to climb higher, the R-3350 engine still killed randomly. Bombers still burned on takeoff. Mechanics still whispered prayers. But the concept worked. Wellwood Beale's impossible idea, the pressurized cabin that every conventional thinker said was too heavy, too complex, too fragile for combat, had created a bomber that dominated Japanese airspace through altitude advantage alone. Then Curtis LeMay took command in January 1945 and changed everything. General Curtis LeMay studied combat results with an engineer's cold analysis and reached a conclusion that shocked everyone who understood what the B-29 was designed to do. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Not because the aircraft couldn't reach altitude or survive at altitude. The B-29s owned the sky above 30,000 ft, but they weren't destroying targets. Cloud cover over Japan was constant. Industrial targets disappeared under weather fronts that lasted weeks. Bombardiers releasing bombs from 6 miles up through solid overcast were aiming at coordinates on maps. Not factories. They could see. Accuracy was terrible. The Norden bomb sight, the secret device that was supposed to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 ft, was useless when clouds hid the target, until seconds before release. The jet stream made everything worse. Winds at 30,000 ft over Japan topped 300 mph. Bomber formations flying into headwinds crawled over the ground. Flying with the jet stream, they raced over targets so fast bombardiers couldn't track aim points. The wind threw bombs miles off course. Missions that should have destroyed factories left them untouched, while bombs cratered empty rice paddies. LeMay's solution broke every principle. The B-29 was built on strip out most of the guns to save weight, load up with incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, fly at 5,000 to 8,000 ft at night, and attack the city targets where fires would spread quickly. Night. Attack when Japanese defenses couldn't see the formations coming until they were right overhead. The irony was harsh. The airplane built to fly higher than any enemy fighter could reach would win the war by flying lower than even old interceptors. The pressurized cabin, the revolutionary technology that made 30,000 ft operations possible, became irrelevant. Crews flew unpressurized at altitudes where they didn't need it, breathing normally in air thick enough to keep them safe, while the sophisticated system Beale had bet Boeing's future on sat unused. March 9th to 10th, 1945, Operation Meeting House. 334 B-29s hit Tokyo at low altitude, carrying incendiary bombs designed to create firestorms in Japanese cities built mostly from wood and paper. The bombers flew through searchlight beams that turned night into day, through anti-aircraft fire that killed 16 planes, and through ramming attacks by pilots willing to die if it meant taking one bomber with them. About 100,000 people died in one night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. The firestorm destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo. Japanese defenses built for high-altitude intercepts couldn't handle the change. Searchlight batteries made to find bombers at 25,000 ft couldn't track planes weaving through the city at 5,000 ft. Anti-aircraft guns set for high-altitude fuses exploded shells thousands of feet above the attackers. Fighters scrambled without altitude advantage found themselves in turning fights with bombers that could see them coming and maneuver aggressively. At low altitudes, where the B-29's performance was broad and forgiving, the low-altitude missions proved something unexpected. The engines, the R-3350 power plants that had killed crews during high-altitude takeoffs, finally had enough cooling air. At 5,000 ft, the air was dense. Airflow over the cowlings was massive. The rear cylinders that overheated at high altitudes stayed cool. Valves that failed from heat survived. Magnesium components that caught fire at thin air temperatures stayed below ignition points. The engines that were deadly at $30,000 FT became reliable at $5,000. But the missions also proved Bale's original idea in ways LeMay's tactical changes couldn't undo. When B-29s needed to fly high, when a mission required altitude instead of surprise, Japanese fighters still couldn't stop them. The pressurized cabin worked exactly as designed. It created a plane that could operate in airspace the enemy couldn't fight in. LeMay chose not to use that ability for most missions because low-altitude incendiary attacks destroyed cities faster than high-altitude precision bombing. But the ability existed. The idea was sound. The final proof came with two missions that showed everything Wellwood Bale had imagined. August 6th and 9th, 1945, the Enola Gay and Boxcar carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, flying at 30,000 Hatorfrift. No Japanese fighter got close. The interceptors that scrambled couldn't reach operating altitude before the B-29s were already over the targets. The anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach aircraft at 31,000 left. The bombers flew to their release points at altitudes where they were visible but untouchable, dropped weapons that ended the war, and flew home without serious opposition. The numbers showed both triumph and tragedy. Total B-29s built, 3,970. Total cost, $3,052 billion in 2024 dollars. Combat losses in the Pacific, 414 from all causes. B-29s lost to engine fires on the ground and in the air. Hundreds of B-29s shot down by Japanese fighters at operational altitude, almost none. The R-3350 engine's time between overhauls increased from 100 to 400 hours by war's end, barely enough for an engine that had to power aircraft on missions lasting half a day. After the war, civilian versions with improved turbocompound systems powered Lockheed Constellations and Douglas DC-7s reliably for decades. The engine eventually became trustworthy. Engineers had time to fix the problems that wartime urgency had caused. But in combat, the R-3350 still killed crews even after tens of thousands of modifications. Yet, the B-29 succeeded anyway. The pressurized cabin created a plane Japanese fighters couldn't reach when American commanders chose to use that ability. The atomic bomb missions proved the concept completely. So did every high-altitude raid where B-29s cruised above Japanese interceptors like they weren't even there. LeMay's low-altitude incendiary campaign won the war faster, but it won. Using a plane whose revolutionary design gave commanders options Japanese defenses couldn't stop. Wellwood Bale had been right. Build a bomber that flies where the enemy can't follow, and you don't have to outfight them. The engines were wrong. They tried to kill their own crews from the first test flight to the last combat mission. But America won because one engineer believed altitude was armor, and thin air was a weapon, and 3,000 lb of pressurization equipment was worth more than 3,000 lb of bombs. He built a plane that could fight a war 7 miles high. And when Japanese fighters climbed as high as their engines could take them, they looked up and watched silver fortresses own the sky they couldn't reach. The paradox of the B-29's success lived in the space between what it was designed to do and what it actually did to win the war. Curtis LeMay's low-altitude incendiary campaign destroyed Japanese cities faster and more completely than high-altitude precision bombing ever could. The pressurized cabin, the technology that drove the entire $3 billion program, sat mostly unused during the missions that burned 67 Japanese cities and killed hundreds of thousands. Yet, calling the pressurized cabin. Concept: a failure ignored what happened when commanders chose to use it. The strategic paradox went deeper than tactics. LeMay removed guns from B-29s to carry more incendiaries, but kept the pressurized fuselage intact. The weight penalty Bale had accepted, 3,000 or so of reinforced structure and pressurization equipment, remained in every plane even when flying at altitudes where crews didn't need it. That weight could have been bombs or fuel, but removing the pressurization system would have required redesigning the whole fuselage, and there was no time for that. So the capability flew on every mission, unused but present, waiting for moments when altitude advantage mattered more than payload. Those moments happened more often than the popular story suggested. Mining operations in Japanese harbors and shipping lanes needed precise placement of weapons in specific waterways. Those missions flew at medium altitude where bombardiers could see targets clearly. But Japanese fighters still struggled to reach combat-loaded B-29s. Daylight raids on specific industrial targets, when weather allowed visual bombing, used altitude to reduce losses while keeping accuracy. The plane operated across its full performance range, from 5,000 AOFT in firestorm raids to 31,000 fighter when missions required altitude advantage. The atomic missions showed everything clearly. The Enola Gay and Bockscar needed altitude for two reasons that had nothing to do with enemy defenses. First, the blast radius of atomic weapons meant delivery planes had to be miles away when the bomb went off. Dropping from 30,000 FT gave crews time to make aggressive escape moves and get to a safe distance. Second, the mission was too important to risk. Flying at maximum altitude meant Japanese fighters that did intercept would arrive too tired to fight well. The pressurized cabin made that possible. Crews flew to their targets in shirt-sleeve comfort, staying fully alert for a mission where any mistake could be fatal. The human cost of proving the concept showed both vindication and tragedy. Eddie Allen died with 8 crewmen testing a plane that wasn't ready to fly. 32 dead total in that Seattle crash. Hundreds more died in engine fires during training and combat. Every B-29 lost to mechanical failure represented crews who died not from the enemy, but from technology that promised safety at altitude and delivered death on the ground. Yet those same crews, when they survived takeoff and reached operational altitude, experienced a kind of war their counterparts and other bombers never knew. B-17 and B-24 crews over Europe flew unpressurized missions through flak that killed randomly and fighter attacks that tore formations apart. They wore oxygen masks that froze their faces, heated suits that failed and left men with frostbite needing amputation. They made decisions while hypoxic, slowed by oxygen deprivation they couldn't notice until it was too late. B-29 crews at designed altitude worked in pressurized comfort equal to 8,000 FT elevation. They drank coffee. They moved through the plane without heavy oxygen gear. They stayed sharp through 15-hour missions because their bodies weren't fighting altitude. When Japanese fighters appeared below, struggling to climb higher, B-29 gunners fought from total advantage, rested, alert, using weapons that needed clear minds to operate well. The final report of the B-29 program showed success full of contradictions. The most expensive weapons program in World War II, costing even more than the Manhattan Project, succeeded amazingly while being used in ways its designers never imagined. The pressurized cabin that drove the design was both essential and irrelevant, depending on which missions you looked at. The engines that almost destroyed the program stayed dangerous throughout the war, yet they improved enough to make operations possible. The plane built for high-altitude precision bombing won the war through low-altitude area attacks, yet ended the war with 2 high-altitude precision strikes. That proved the original idea. Absolutely. Wellwood, Beale's revolutionary idea that altitude advantage could beat. Firepower and speed was correct in ways beyond any single mission. The B-29 forced Japanese air defenses to prepare for threats they couldn't fight effectively. Resources were spent making high-altitude interceptors that barely worked. Anti-aircraft guns were set to fire at 30,000 feet. Tactics were planned for formations that might or might not appear at design altitude. Just having a bomber that could fight 7 miles high changed how Japan defended itself, even when American commanders chose to attack at lower altitudes. The engineering legacy was simpler. Pressurized combat planes became standard for every air force that could afford them. The idea Beale promoted in 1940, that crew comfort and performance mattered as much as guns and bombs, shaped every bomber and transport plane designed after the war. The B-29's pressurized fuselage wasn't a luxury or a failed experiment. It became the template for modern aviation. The R-3350 engines told a different story. They killed crews until the war ended. They burned through overhauls faster than maintenance could keep up. They forced mechanics to work miracles to keep planes flyable. But they also produced 200 horsepower per engine, at altitudes where that power mattered, driving superchargers that made 30,000 FT operations possible. The engines were both the villain that almost ruined the program and the necessary part that made success possible. After the war, with time to develop properly, they became reliable engines that served civilian aviation for decades. But bomber crews flying them in combat never forgot the sound of a Wright Cyclone engine starting to fail, the sight of magnesium fire eating a wing spar, or the knowledge that every takeoff was a gamble against physics. 3,970 B-29s built, $3 billion spent, 414 lost in combat, hundreds more lost to the engines that powered them, and zero, exactly zero, shot down by Japanese fighters when flying at the altitude Wellwood Bale promised would make them untouchable. The engineer was right, the engines were wrong, and America won because one man believed you could win a war not by outfighting the enemy, but by flying where they couldn't.